Please, don't make me call security. The lead flight attendant's voice rang out, cold and sharp, drawing the attention of every passenger in first class. All eyes turned toward the front, where a poised black woman sat calmly in one of the luxurious leather seats. She didn't appear to be causing trouble, yet in the eyes of Victoria Hayes, the flight attendant in charge, she was someone who simply didn't belong. That woman was Aiva Sinclair. Slowly she looked up, her gaze steady, exuding an air of quiet authority. I've already told you, Aiva's voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried the kind of weight that commanded attention. I'm not going anywhere. A murmur spread through the cabin. A well-dressed woman leaned toward her husband, whispering under her breath. What is she doing? Probably just another one trying to sneak into first class for free. Across the aisle, Ethan Carter, a middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit, frowned slightly. He didn't like how the flight attendant was handling the situation, but he wasn't sure if he should intervene. Victoria crossed her arms, her lips curling into a cold smile. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to call security and have you removed from this plane. The silence in the first-class cabin was thick. Every second felt like an eternity. But Aiva didn't move. Call whoever you need, she said slowly. But I'm not leaving. No one could predict what was about to unfold. A furious flight attendant determined to assert her control, a mysterious passenger who refused to back down, and a truth waiting to be revealed. One that would shake the entire cabin and make this a flight no one would ever forget. Have you ever been judged unfairly just because of how you look? If so, stay with us, because what happens next will shock the entire flight. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thick. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some uncomfortable, some curious. But no one spoke. The curtains separating first class from the rest of the plane remained drawn, keeping this exclusive space detached from the rest of the aircraft. Aiva Sinclair didn't say another word. She simply rested her hand on the armrest, maintaining her unshakable composure. She could feel Victoria Hayes' icy stare drilling into her, the flight attendant's posture stiff, her hands clenched at her sides, the silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Then, suddenly, Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. Her voice took on a sugary sweet tone, laced with condescension. You must not realize that this section is reserved for our VIP guests. Aiva tilted her head slightly. Oh, I realize. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her unwavering confidence that made Victoria hesitate for just a second. Still, she pressed on. Then you must have booked the wrong seat, she continued, her fake politeness barely masking her irritation. Economy is in the back. If you need assistance, I'd be happy to help you find the correct section. The words cut through the air like an invisible blade. A few passengers pretended not to hear, shifting awkwardly in their seats. Others, like Jessica Lawson, a wealthy socialite seated nearby, let out an amused chuckle, as if she were watching an entertaining spectacle. A few rows ahead, Ethan Carter lowered his newspaper, watching the scene unfold. He didn't like what he was seeing, but he wasn't sure if stepping in was his place. Aiva, however, remained completely still, her deep, dark eyes locked onto Victoria's without flinching. She wasn't angry, she wasn't defensive, she was simply waiting. Then, her voice, smooth and steady, cut through the tension. Are you sure you don't want to check the passenger list? 1 second. 2 seconds. Victoria blinked. For the briefest moment, she hesitated, but then quickly dismissed the thought, letting out a small, dismissive laugh. There's no need for that. I work on these flights every day. I know exactly who belongs here. Aiva let out a quiet, measured breath, as if she had expected this very response. Behind Victoria, Grace Adams, a young flight attendant barely a year into the job, had been watching everything unfold. She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the passenger list clipped near the cockpit. She had seen Aiva Sinclair's name there. But should she say something? Her gaze flickered between Victoria, her demanding, no-nonsense supervisor, and Aiva, who sat completely at ease, as if none of this fazed her. A part of her wanted to speak up, but another part of her was terrified of the consequences. Victoria, meanwhile, squared her shoulders, her voice growing more assertive. I'm going to ask you one last time. I won't repeat myself. Either you move on your own, or I'll call security to have you escorted out. Aiva didn't flinch. If there was one thing she had learned from years in the business world, it was patience. She slowly crossed her arms, leaned back into her seat, and looked straight at Victoria. "Do what you need to do." From the front row, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, an older couple, exchanged curious glances. Mr. Thompson lowered his newspaper slightly, watching with interest. Jessica Lawson, the woman who had sneered earlier, leaned toward her husband again. "This is ridiculous. Who does she think she is?" Victoria smirked, throwing Aiva a look of triumph before swiftly reaching for the radio clipped to her hip. She pressed the button. "I need security in first class. Immediately." The words cut through the cabin like a whip. Passengers started whispering. A few heads turned. Across the aisle, Ethan Carter, the businessman in a tailored gray suit, furrowed his brows and set his newspaper down completely. He wasn't sure what was going on yet, but something about this felt off. A younger flight attendant hesitantly stepped closer to Victoria, lowering her voice. "Are you sure? I think?" Victoria cut her off sharply. "I'm sure." She turned back to Aiva, this time with a smug expression. "Did you really think you could just sit here forever?" Aiva smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It wasn't even a smile of defiance. It was a warning. "You really shouldn't be doing this." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry. But the weight of those words silenced the entire cabin. Passengers who had been indifferent a moment ago suddenly felt a shift in the air. For the first time, doubt crept into their minds. Not about Aiva, but about Victoria. Who was this woman that Victoria was so determined to remove? And more importantly, what if she wasn't just some ordinary passenger? The atmosphere in first class felt thick, not with tension, but with anticipation. Aiva's voice carried no hostility, yet it held a power that even Victoria failed to recognize. But Victoria Hayes, blinded by her own arrogance, didn't see the warning signs. She stood tall, her expression smug, as if she had just put an unruly passenger in her place. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Some passengers started to sense that something was wrong. Ethan Carter, the businessman, studied Aiva more closely. He had flown first class more times than he could count. He had seen all kinds of people, entitled elites, nervous upgraders, quiet travelers who kept to themselves. But this woman? There was something different about her. She wasn't a desperate freeloader trying to sneak into first class. She wasn't an insecure person demanding to be seen. She was someone with real power. Jessica Lawson, the well-dressed socialite with the Hermes bag resting on her lap, still found the whole scene amusing. She whispered to her husband, "She's really clinging to that seat like she belongs here. It's almost funny." But her husband didn't answer, because without realizing it, he had started looking at Aiva differently too. And then came the sound that changed everything. Footsteps. 2 uniformed security officers entered the cabin, their expressions unreadable. They didn't rush in aggressively. They didn't immediately force anyone out. They simply stood there, waiting for instructions. Victoria crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with satisfaction. "All right then," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She gestured toward Aiva. "It's time to go. We don't want to make a scene, but you can't stay here." Aiva didn't budge. She simply rested both hands on her lap, her gaze never leaving Victoria. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost unnerving, she asked, "So you're really going to remove me from my own seat?" Victoria scoffed. "Your seat? And who told you this was your seat?" And then, the final warning. Aiva tilted her head slightly, her eyes darkening, not with anger but with a chilling certainty. Her voice, no longer light, cut through the air like a blade. "I'm giving you one last chance to check the passenger list." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to, but those words hit like a shockwave. A strange sensation crept down Victoria's spine. For a fleeting second, she felt something she hadn't before. Unease. But instead of stopping, she threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Who do you think you are?" she sneered. "I don't have time to check anything. Stand up now, or I'll have to take more drastic measures." Nearby, Grace Adams, the young flight attendant, couldn't take it anymore. With careful, hesitant steps, she inched toward the passenger list near the cockpit, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the printed names. And the moment her eyes landed on one particular name, her breath caught in her throat. She nearly dropped the list. That name. It was right there. Aiva Sinclair, owner of Atlantic Air. Grace froze. Her throat went dry. Her heart pounded. She turned back to look at Victoria, her mind racing. What should she do? What could she say? But before she could utter a single word, Victoria barked out her next order. Escort her out. The two security officers took a step forward, but just as they were about to lay a hand on Aiva, she lifted her hand. Stop. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. The officers halted immediately. They were trained to follow orders, but there was something about her voice, something that made them listen. Aiva slowly rose to her feet, not out of fear, not out of submission, but because it was time to end this charade. She locked eyes with Victoria, her voice steady, deliberate. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. And in that moment, Victoria felt the chill crawl down her spine. A deathly silence swallowed first class. Every passenger held their breath. No one spoke, but their eyes were waiting for whatever storm was about to break. Victoria, still wearing the mask of arrogance, looked Aiva up and down with a scoff. Her fingers clenched tightly around her radio, as if she needed something to hold on to steady herself. I made a mistake? Victoria let out another hollow laugh, her voice dripping with disdain. No, you're the one making a mistake by thinking you can sit here like you actually belong. A few passengers raised their eyebrows. Belong? Aiva didn't respond right away. She simply stared at Victoria, unreadable, unwavering. To the side, Ethan Carter gently set his glass of wine down on the table. He wasn't reading the paper anymore. He wasn't remaining neutral anymore. He knew. He had just witnessed something far more troubling than a petty dispute over a seat. But Victoria still didn't see it. She turned away, looking at the security officers, and gave them a curt nod. Remove her. The two men hesitated. They hadn't forgotten the quiet authority in Aiva's voice moments ago. But an order was an order. And then, something happened that no one expected. Just as one of the officers moved forward, Aiva calmly picked up her phone. She tapped out a short message, then she placed it gently on the table. A simple action. But it made Victoria frown. What do you think you're doing? She demanded. Aiva looked up, her gaze steady. Just sending a message. Victoria narrowed her eyes. To who? Aiva's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. You'll find out soon enough. The unease inside Victoria deepened. From across the cabin, Grace Adams stood stiffly near the passenger list, clutching the paper like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Because she knew. She knew that the name Aiva Sinclair wasn't just another first-class passenger. But before she could speak, Victoria stormed up to Aiva, her voice dropping into a venomous hiss. Who do you think you are? Someone important? A few passengers exhaled sharply. That question should have never been asked. Aiva slowly rose to her feet, and as she did, she adjusted the collar of her blazer with an effortless grace that sent a ripple of tension through the room. Every pair of eyes in the cabin followed her every movement. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to be angry. Her presence alone was enough to silence the room. I tried to give you a chance, Aiva said, her voice low but heavy with meaning. A chance to step back and reconsider, but you refused. Victoria crossed her arms, still unwilling to back down. Oh, is that so? Aiva nodded slowly. And now you'll have to face the consequences. The consequences. Two words that landed like a thunderclap inside the cabin. Something sharp flickered in Victoria's gaze. She frowned and then suddenly let out a laugh that was just a little too forced, a little too hollow. A laugh meant to cover up the growing unease creeping into her chest. Oh, I'm so scared, she mocked, shrugging dramatically. What are you going to do? Write a bad review? Call the airline's complaint hotline? A small chuckle escaped from Jessica Lawson, but she quickly shut her mouth when she realized no one else was laughing. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan Carter glanced at his watch. He wasn't sure if he was imagining things, but the flight attendants seemed different now. A few minutes ago, they had been avoiding Aiva's gaze. But now, they were waiting. Like they knew Victoria had gone too far. But none of them wanted to be the first to say it. Until Grace did. The young flight attendant clenched her hands into fists. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward with quiet determination. Victoria, her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes were steady. We need to check the passenger list. Victoria whipped around as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. What did you just say? Grace swallowed hard. I just think we should double-check, she said hesitantly, holding out the clipboard with the list. Victoria snatched it from her hands, her eyes scanning down the names with impatient flicks. And then, she stopped. Her eyes froze on a single name. She frowned. Then she blinked. Aiva Sinclair. But it wasn't just a name. Aiva Sinclair, owner of Atlantic Air. Victoria's entire world tilted. Her hand trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay composed. She looked at Aiva, then back at the list, as if trying to convince herself that she had read it wrong, but she hadn't. Aiva hadn't moved. She stood there, unwavering. And then, Aiva took a single step forward. Victoria instinctively stepped back. For the first time, her confidence cracked. Aiva locked eyes with her, her voice quiet but searing. You just destroyed your own career. The air shattered. A few passengers gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if suddenly realizing they didn't want to be caught in the middle of this. Ethan Carter leaned forward, pressing his hands onto the table. His sharp eyes gleamed, and for the first time since the flight began, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Like he had just watched a movie with the perfect plot twist. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing. But no words came out. Aiva wasn't in a rush. She reached down, picked up her phone, typed out a message, and then looked up at Victoria one last time. You'll find out soon enough what happens next. And at that exact moment, the cockpit door swung open. Captain Daniel Reynolds stepped out, his face pale as a sheet. His eyes darted toward Victoria, then to Aiva, his expression stunned. He swallowed hard, his voice unsteady as he spoke. Miss Sinclair, I didn't know you were on this flight. Silence. The kind of silence that crushed the air out of the room. And that was the moment Victoria realized her entire world had just collapsed. The first-class cabin suddenly felt like a grand stage, a theater where every passenger had unknowingly taken a front-row seat to a performance they never expected to witness. Captain Daniel Reynolds stood frozen in the aisle, his pale face revealing the severity of the situation. His gaze flickered between Aiva Sinclair and Victoria Hayes, the latter still gripping the passenger list so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Miss Sinclair? Reynolds' voice wavered, as if every word had to be carefully measured before being spoken. I didn't know you were on this flight. He stopped, because there was nothing he could say to justify what had just happened. Every eye in the cabin turned to Victoria. Her arrogance had been exposed, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. Victoria scoffed, throwing the passenger list onto the table with a defiant smirk. So what? What does it matter who she is? Across the aisle, Ethan Carter drummed his fingers against the table, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if he were watching the final act of a play, just waiting for the curtain to fall. Aiva still hadn't spoken. She simply stood there, her expression calm, unwavering, as if she were giving Victoria every opportunity to dig her own grave. And then it happened. Victoria stormed toward Aiva, her eyes burning with months, maybe years of suppressed frustration. I don't care who you are, she spat. You don't belong here. You don't get to sit here. You don't get to act like you're more important than anyone else on this flight. Her final words exploded into the cabin like a gunshot. Aiva didn't react. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. And that only drove Victoria further into her rage. A passenger whispered, "What is she doing?" Grace Adams pressed herself against the aisle, frozen. She wanted to stop Victoria, but she couldn't move, and then, the slap. Victoria lost all control. For a brief, fleeting second, she lifted her hand and struck Aiva Sinclair across the face. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. It was sharp, brutal. Final. The entire cabin froze. Passengers stopped breathing. The sheer force of the slap cut through every whisper, every doubt, every excuse. Jessica Lawson's mouth fell open, her fingers tightening around her wine glass so hard it nearly shattered. Ethan Carter shot up from his seat, his eyes burning with a fury that had been buried deep beneath years of corporate diplomacy. Grace clamped both hands over her mouth, unable to even gasp. But the only person who didn't react was Aiva Sinclair. She stood there, unmoved. She didn't touch her cheek, she didn't step back, she didn't even look hurt. There was no anger in her eyes, no pain. Just disappointment. Victoria stiffened. As if the moment she lowered her hand, she realized what she had done. A mistake. A mistake that would change her life forever. But instead of stepping back, she did what desperate people always do. She searched for an escape. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally. Someone, anyone, someone to stand beside her, to defend her, to validate her rage, but no one did. Because every pair of eyes was fixed on Aiva. Waiting, watching, expecting. And then, the voice that broke the silence, Ethan Carter. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Victoria snapped her head toward him, her mouth opening, ready to fight, ready to defend herself. But then, Aiva's voice rang out. Calm, sharp, unyielding. I'm no longer giving you a chance. She picked up her phone again, typed a few short words, then set it back down on the table. Victoria stared at the screen, a wave of unease rising in her chest. What did you just do? Her voice came out dry, almost hoarse. Aiva didn't answer right away. Instead, she smoothly adjusted the cuff of her blazer, then locked eyes with Victoria. You'll find out soon enough. And then, a voice crackled through the radio in Victoria's hand. Captain, we have an urgent call from airline management. They're requesting to speak with you immediately. Victoria blinked. For the first time, fear crept into her expression. Aiva studied her one last time, a look that made Victoria realize this was no longer a game. This situation was only just beginning. Victoria's hand trembled as the radio buzzed again. Captain, I repeat, airline management is requesting to speak with you immediately. The air inside first class became so thick, no one dared to breathe. Victoria tightened her grip on the radio, clinging to the last shred of authority she had left. I'm busy, she snapped, her voice tinged with rising panic. Tell them I'll call back later. A few passengers exchanged glances. They knew this wasn't normal. And then, Aiva Sinclair casually reached for the glass of water on the table, lifted it to her lips, and took a slow sip. A gesture so effortlessly composed it was almost unsettling, as if the chaos unraveling around her didn't affect her in the slightest. She set the glass down, her eyes still locked onto Victoria. You're going to want to answer that call, Aiva said, her voice low but cutting like a blade. Victoria involuntarily stepped back. All she wanted to do was escape Aiva's gaze. But she couldn't move. The two security officers exchanged uncertain glances. The feeling of unease in the air had become undeniable. And then, the cockpit door swung open again. Captain Daniel Reynolds stepped out, but this time his face was not just pale, it was filled with sheer dread. He walked swiftly toward Victoria, but before addressing her, he turned to Aiva and gave a respectful nod. Only then did he turn back to the stiff, frozen flight attendant. Victoria, Reynolds' voice was no longer neutral. It was tense, urgent. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Victoria whipped around, her eyes wild with confusion. What? Reynolds held her gaze, then lowered his voice just enough for the entire cabin to hear. You just humiliated and slapped the owner of this airline. The words detonated like a bomb. Jessica Lawson nearly spilled her wine, her eyes widening in disbelief. Ethan Carter leaned back into his seat, slowly crossing his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips. Silence swallowed the cabin whole. The owner of the airline? Victoria felt her legs go weak. She didn't believe it. She couldn't believe it. Her heart pounded violently in her chest as she turned and locked eyes with Aiva. But Aiva was just as calm as before, unshaken, unbothered, unmovable. And in that moment, Victoria understood. Aiva's gaze was not the gaze of a woman pretending to be someone, not the gaze of someone waiting for others to defend her, but the gaze of someone with absolute power. And Victoria Hayes had just destroyed herself. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Aiva's voice drifted through the cabin, soft as a feather, yet heavy as stone. Now do you understand? Victoria stumbled back, her mouth opening, but no words came out. She turned to Captain Reynolds. No, this can't be. Reynolds looked at her with nothing but disappointment. You should have checked the passenger list from the start. Victoria's world crumbled. From the one who ruled first class, to nothing more than someone desperately clinging to the last shreds of her power. And then, her radio crackled again. Victoria Hayes, you are ordered to leave this flight immediately. This is a directive from airline management. She couldn't stand straight anymore. The two security officers shifted their focus. They weren't looking at Aiva anymore. They were looking at Victoria. Jessica Lawson inhaled sharply. Ethan Carter narrowed his eyes, his lips curling in satisfaction, as if he had seen this coming all along. Victoria struggled. No, this isn't right. This is a mistake. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know. For the first time in her life, she felt completely powerless. Aiva's expression never changed. She simply stood there, locking eyes with Victoria, her voice steady, cold as tempered steel. You're right, you didn't know. And that is what destroyed you. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth had already spoken for itself. Victoria was escorted out. As she walked past the passengers, all eyes followed her. Some with pity, others with satisfaction. No one defended her. The moment the cabin door shut behind Victoria, the atmosphere inside first class changed completely. A passenger whispered, "I've never seen anything like that before." Jessica Lawson kept her head down, avoiding Aiva's gaze. Ethan Carter let out a low chuckle. Brilliant. And then Aiva sat down. She picked up her glass, took a small sip, and set it back down, as if nothing had ever happened. Silence. But this time, it wasn't tension. It was respect. Aiva Sinclair never had to raise her voice. She never had to fight back. She never had to argue. She simply existed. And the truth revealed itself. A lesson had been taught. A queen had been dethroned. But the story wasn't over yet, because Victoria had just stepped to a nightmare far worse than this. And as for Aiva, she had one last thing to do. Victoria Hayes stepped out of first class. Once she had ruled this space. Now she was nothing more than a trembling shadow of herself. Her steps wavered, no authority, no sharp commands. Now she was the one being escorted out. The two security officers flanked her, leading her toward the exit. But Victoria still struggled. "You can't do this to me. I've worked here for 10 years. I have rights." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a blank expression, cast her a look of sheer disinterest. "You lost that right the moment you laid a hand on a passenger," the officer said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. Victoria fell silent. She looked around, searching for someone to save her. But no one stepped forward. Not a single flight attendant, not a single passenger. They simply stood there watching her, as if witnessing something irreversible. And then, the cabin doors shut in her face. Victoria Hayes was left standing on the tarmac, a woman who once had power, now stripped of everything. Inside the cabin, Aiva Sinclair remained seated. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply observed. The energy in first class had completely shifted. The very passengers who had once looked at her with doubt were now silent. Because now, they knew they were wrong. They had watched an injustice unfold before their eyes, and they had done nothing. Jessica Lawson gripped her wineglass, unable to meet Aiva's gaze. Ethan Carter tilted his head slightly, studying Aiva with new eyes. Respect, admiration. And then, someone spoke. Grace Adams, the young flight attendant, the only one who had tried to do the right thing. Slowly, she stepped forward, guilt written across her face. "Miss Sinclair?" Her voice wavered. I'm so sorry." Aiva looked up at her, her expression steady. "You're not the one who needs to apologize." Grace exhaled sharply, as if releasing a weight she had been carrying. "But I didn't speak up sooner," she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "I saw your name on the list. I knew Victoria was wrong, but I was afraid." Aiva held her gaze for a long moment. Then, she gave a small knowing nod. "We all feel fear sometimes," she said quietly. "What matters is what we learn from it." Grace stared at her, and for the first time her eyes shone with something deeper. But before she could say anything else, the cabin doors opened again. And this time, 2 police officers stepped inside. Outside, Victoria Hayes stood frozen as a police car pulled up just beyond the jet bridge. 2 officers stepped out, their movements precise, their presence unmistakable. One of them, a tall, white-haired man, walked straight toward her. "Victoria Hayes?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Victoria opened her mouth. No words came out. Then, the second officer read aloud the charges. "You are under arrest for assaulting a passenger on a commercial flight. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victoria staggered back. She couldn't process what was happening. No, this isn't real. The lead officer reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around." Panic. Pure, uncontrollable panic. "I didn't mean to. I just..." But there were no excuses left. The cold touch of metal snapped shut around her wrists. The sharp click of the handcuffs rang through the air. a sound that marked the end of a life once filled with power. And then, Victoria Hayes was led away. Aiva Sinclair remained seated. She did not smile, she did not gloat, but her eyes were unwavering. She knew a lesson had been taught. The first person to break the silence was Ethan Carter. He lowered his newspaper, looked straight at Aiva, and nodded. "I thought I had seen everything," he said slowly. "But today, I realize I still have a lot to learn." A few passengers nodded in agreement. Jessica Lawson, the woman who had mocked Aiva earlier, bit her lip. She knew she had been wrong too. She knew. This was a moment no one on this flight would ever forget. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have resolved the situation. Our flight will be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." Outside the window, the sun had risen higher, its golden light streaming through the cabin. A storm had passed. But Aiva knew this was just the beginning, because from this day forward, everything would change. And Victoria Hayes was only the first lesson. The afternoon sun cast long streaks of gold across first class. The glimmer of light danced off crystal glasses, reflecting on the fine leather seats. But no one cared about the luxury anymore. They were still reeling from what had just unfolded. Victoria Hayes had been arrested, a career ended, on the very flight she thought she controlled. But this story was far from over. Aiva Sinclair remained still. She didn't rush. She didn't shift in her seat. But now, the way people looked at her had changed completely. No more doubt. No more whispers. Only silence. A silence filled with respect. Ethan Carter, the well-dressed businessman, closed his newspaper for good. Slowly, he lifted his glass, taking a measured sip, his once detached expression now deep in thought. He set his drink down. Then, turning to Aiva, he spoke. "Miss Sinclair." Aiva turned to him, her dark eyes steady and calm. "Yes?" Ethan drew a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "I owe you an apology." Silence. Not because it was shocking, but because Ethan Carter was not the kind of man who apologized easily. Aiva didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him, waiting. Ethan pressed his lips together, then continued. "I sat here and watched everything unfold. I saw the injustice, but I didn't speak up, because I thought it wasn't my problem." Aiva tilted her head slightly. Her gaze was sharp, but it did not carry judgment. Ethan let out a long breath. "But I was wrong, because my silence made me no different from the ones on the wrong side." The other passengers exchanged looks. Some lowered their gazes, because they felt the same guilt. Aiva slowly placed her hand on the armrest. Then she spoke, her voice calm, yet carrying undeniable power. "The world doesn't change because bad people do bad things. The world changes when good people sit back and allow it to happen." Her words struck everyone. Jessica Lawson, the woman who had mocked Aiva earlier, bit her lip. She knew she had been wrong. But Aiva's words weren't just for Victoria, they were for all of them. As the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy with reflection, Aiva reached for her phone. A new message appeared on the screen. She opened it, read it quickly, then nodded. A moment later, a new announcement rang through the plane. "Miss Sinclair, we have received your directive. Everything is ready." Jessica Lawson blinked. Ethan Carter studied Aiva with curiosity. "Ready? Ready for what?" Aiva placed her phone down. Then she turned her gaze toward Grace Adams, the only flight attendant who had tried to speak the truth. "Grace," Aiva called her name calmly. Grace flinched slightly but quickly straightened up. "Yes, Miss Sinclair?" Aiva looked at her for a moment. Her gaze was no longer cold. It held recognition. "I need you to help me with something." Grace felt a flicker of tension but nodded immediately. "Of course, anything." Aiva gave her a small smile, a smile that made Grace feel like she had done the right thing. As Victoria Hayes was placed into the police car, a crowd of reporters was already waiting. News of the incident on board had leaked. And now, the world wanted to know the truth. A media storm was about to explode. But Aiva Sinclair, she was ready. Because this wasn't just about punishing one person. She was about to change an entire system. And this was just the beginning. Outside the airport, the air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. A swarm of reporters had already gathered, microphones lifted high, cameras flashing non-stop. News of Victoria Hayes, the disgraced chief flight attendant arrested for assault and discrimination, had spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know what really happened on Flight 407 of Atlantic Air. But Victoria, The woman who once ruled first class with an iron grip now stood in front of flashing cameras, wearing handcuffs. Her face pale, her lips trembled. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to save her. But no one stood beside her. She was completely alone. A female reporter stepped forward, her voice sharp and direct. "Miss Hayes, do you have anything to say about your actions?" Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. A single response echoed from behind her. "Actions have consequences." The voice didn't belong to a reporter. It belonged to Aiva Sinclair. And instantly, every microphone turned toward her. Aiva stood up. She had been silent long enough. Now, it was time to speak. The passengers watched her closely, their gazes a mixture of respect and curiosity. Grace swallowed hard, standing nearby, not daring to blink. Ethan Carter set down his newspaper, leaning back in his seat, as if preparing to witness a lesson unlike any he had ever learned. Jessica Lawson pressed her lips together, her hands tightening in her lap. They all knew. They weren't just about to hear a statement. They were about to witness a shift. No one spoke. Slowly, she stepped forward, into the center of the cabin where everyone could see her. "I'm not speaking to humiliate anyone." Her voice wasn't loud, but every word was sharp. It rang through the space like a blade slicing through glass. "I'm not speaking to seek revenge." She paused. Her gaze swept across the cabin, locking onto every pair of eyes. "I'm speaking because this isn't just about me. This is about all of us." A silent wave rippled through the passengers. They understood. They truly understood. Because every single one of them, in one way or another, had once been part of the problem. Aiva slowly turned toward the cabin doors, where Victoria Hayes had just been escorted out. When Victoria acted the way she did, the problem wasn't that she didn't know who I was. The problem was that she thought she had the right to treat others that way. A few passengers nodded subtly. No one disagreed, and I'm not the first person to be treated like this. The only difference is that this time I didn't stay silent. Ethan Carter let out a small chuckle, not in amusement, but in admiration. Jessica Lawson lowered her gaze, her hands tightened around each other. But Aiva wasn't finished. Justice isn't just about punishing those who do wrong. It's about changing how we see the problem. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, our flight will be taking off shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for departure." The remaining flight attendants hurried back to their positions, but they were not the same. The way they looked at Aiva had changed. The way they looked at every passenger had changed. Because now, they understood that everyone deserved respect. Aiva sat down, her gaze drifted toward the window. The sunlight spilled across her face. Above her, the sky stretched endlessly. She knew. The storm wasn't over, but she was ready for it. The plane began rolling onto the runway, its wheels moving slowly over the pavement. Outside, the sky stretched wider, as if it too was waiting for a change. Inside first class, the tension had eased, but the air still carried a weight. Something unspoken lingered between the passengers. They sat in their seats, but none of them were the same people they had been before stepping onto this flight. Jessica Lawson ran a hand through her hair, as if steadying herself. For the first time, when she glanced at Aiva, it wasn't with disdain or doubt, it was with respect. Ethan Carter slowly pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen, as if he was writing something important. And Grace Adams, the young flight attendant who had found her voice today, stood near Aiva, her eyes filled with newfound determination. She had learned something today, something she would never forget. Just then, a soft beep from the intercom. Then Captain Daniel Reynolds' deep voice filled the cabin. "Miss Sinclair, airline management would like to speak with you immediately." The passengers blinked in surprise. Aiva simply picked up her phone, pressing the connection button. A familiar voice came through the other end. "Aiva, we've seen everything. We need to meet with you as soon as the plane lands." Aiva wasn't surprised. She had anticipated this. "I have a few things to discuss as well," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about Victoria Hayes. This is about how our entire system operates." A deep sigh came from the other end. "We understand and we're ready to listen." Aiva smiled faintly. That was exactly what she wanted. This was never just about punishing one person. It was about changing the system. As the plane accelerated down the runway, a flight attendant stepped beside Aiva. "Miss Sinclair, would you like anything to drink?" No coldness in her tone, no hesitation, only respect. Aiva shook her head slightly. "Thank you, I'm fine." But just as the attendant turned to leave, Aiva spoke again. "But I do have one question." The flight attendant paused, turning back. "Yes, Miss Sinclair?" Aiva looked at her. Her voice was soft, but it carried undeniable weight. "If this had happened to another passenger, someone who wasn't me, would they have received the same justice?" The flight attendant didn't know how to answer. Grace Adams, standing nearby, took a deep breath and answered for her. "Before today, probably not. But from now on, I believe things will be different." Aiva held Grace's gaze. She saw something in the young woman's eyes, a flicker of hope, a real change. She nodded. "Good." Meanwhile, in economy class, some passengers had already begun reading the news on their phones. The story of this flight had spread, and the headlines flashed across their screens. Atlantic Air Chief Flight Attendant arrested for assaulting the airline's owner. A tale of arrogance and consequences. Passengers witnessed the fall of injustice mid-flight. The priceless lesson from the most unforgettable flight of the year. A young passenger turned to his friend. "Oh my God, have you seen this post?" The person next to him leaned in, eyes widening. "What, we're on that flight?" Both of them turned to look toward first class. Curious, respectful, astonished. But Aiva, she remained still, composed, as if completely unbothered by the growing storm outside. But she knew this was no longer just about one flight. It had spread, and it would continue to ripple outward, unstoppable, because sometimes one act of courage is enough to change an entire system, and Aiva Sinclair had just ignited that change. The plane soared through the clouds, the golden hues of the evening sun painting the sky in warm streaks. From her first-class window, Aiva gazed outward, her eyes following the sun as it slowly dipped beyond the horizon. This flight was no longer just a journey. It had become a symbol of change, of justice, of the courage to stand up. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. Today, she had not just fought for her own justice. She had opened a door to a world where respect was not a privilege, but a right for all. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. One trip had ended, but another journey was only beginning. Aiva stood up, adjusted her blazer, and walked toward the exit. This time, no one looked away as she passed. No more doubtful stares, no more hushed whispers, only silence. A silence filled with contemplation, and perhaps, for the first time, a little respect. As she stepped off the plane, she knew, from this day forward, nothing would ever be the same again. Have you ever been judged just because of the way you look? Have you ever felt dismissed or disrespected simply because someone thought you didn't belong? Aiva Sinclair may be a character in this story, but what she went through is not fiction. This is happening, every day, everywhere. But today, one person stood up, and sometimes, that's all it takes to start a revolution. Have you ever witnessed an injustice like this? What would you have done in Aiva's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect, hit like to spread this story to more people. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, hit subscribe to Aiva Stories now. We don't just tell stories. We tell stories that change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching. And always remember, justice doesn't just come from those in power. It comes from those who choose to stand up. See you in the next story.